Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to step back into the flickering glow of a theater screen where velvet curtains hide more than just a stage and where one man slipped out of the world as if the dark itself swallowed him whole. Picture this: New York City, 1958. The neon marquees blaze along 42nd Street, cars honk through the foggy winter night, and strangers crowd into the Empire Palace Theater to escape the chill outside. It's a Saturday, the theater is packed, and the air smells of buttered popcorn and cigarette smoke. Somewhere in the middle row sits a man named Robert Klein, a 32-year-old clerk who treated himself to a solo night out. By all accounts, he was ordinary, slim, polite, a guy who clocked in at the banks each morning and disappeared into the crowd each night. But on this particular evening, Robert vanished in a way no detective, no stagehand, and no audience member could ever properly explain. Because when the house lights came up at the end of the feature, Robert's seat was empty. His coat was draped over the armrest. His half-eaten box of candy sat on the floor. But the man himself was gone. Every exit door had been watched, every aisle crowded, and yet no one saw him leave. A murder mystery has occurred, or perhaps something stranger. And before we dive deeper, let me pause to say, if you enjoy unraveling these eerie, unsolved cases with me, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. It helps me bring more of these late night journeys right to you. And drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from. You might discover someone just down the street is tuned in too. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The first police reports describe the scene in almost clinical detail. Theater doors bolted, ushers at every aisle, and hundreds of witnesses swearing the man was there until suddenly he wasn't. They searched the restrooms, the projection booth, even the rafters above the screen. Nothing. Robert Klein had evaporated into the velvet-lined walls of the Empire Palace. The strangest detail, his wristwatch. Investigators later found it under the seat, stopped at exactly 9:17 p.m., though the film continued well past 10. It ticked normally when rewound, but forensics noted the spring had jammed in a way that didn't make sense for a watch less than a year old. History records that the Empire Palace had already been notorious before this case. Built in 1911 during New York's theater boom, it had survived fires, bankruptcies, and prohibition raids. Local lore claimed that during the 1920s, gangsters used its basement as a meeting point, bribing the ushers to keep a side door unlocked. And in 1937, a balcony collapse killed 3 patrons, leading to whispered curses that the theater was unlucky. So when Robert Klein disappeared, the press latched on quickly. Vanished in the velvet darkness, screamed one headline. Another declared the Empire Palace the theater of no return. Within days, ticket sales doubled, not because people feared the place, but because they wanted to see the stage where reality itself had cracked. Police, of course, weren't buying curses. They interviewed the projectionist, a man named Earl Parsons, who swore that he saw nothing unusual. He threaded the film, dimmed the lights, and kept his eyes on the reels. But later, another staffer whispered that Earl had been muttering to himself all night, glancing at the shadows on the wall, as though someone stood behind him. Stranger still, 2 teenagers sitting near Robert's row told detectives they noticed a flicker on the screen around the moment he supposedly vanished. Not a projector hiccup, not a burned frame, but a figure, tall, pale, standing in the corner of the image. They swore the figure wasn't part of the movie. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the teens truly saw something anomalous or whether memory simply stitched in a ghost where there was only confusion. But the fact remained, one man had gone missing inside a locked theater in front of hundreds of people. As the investigation deepened, police tried to reconstruct Robert's final movements. He'd purchased his ticket at 7:54 p.m. exact change from his wallet. The usher remembered him, politely nodding, walking straight down the aisle, and choosing a middle seat in row G. Several patrons recalled his presence, noting the way he quietly laughed at the comedy trailer. Then the feature began a crime noir called The Final Alibi. Heavy shadows, cigarette smoke detectives in fedoras stalking rain-slicked streets.
Ironically, it was a film about a man who faked his own death to escape gangsters. At 9:15, the reel reportedly hiccuped, a brief blur almost imperceptible. 2 minutes later, Robert Klein was gone. One woman swore she saw him slump forward, then straighten up again. Another claimed he leaned toward the aisle and whispered something before vanishing. But when detectives asked her to repeat the words, she faltered. I I don't remember. Maybe I dreamed it. This wasn't the first time a patron had complained of strange happenings in the Empire Palace. Old ushers spoke of cold drafts rushing through the balcony, even in summer, and of hearing applause from empty seats long after closing. One even claimed he saw a man in a gray suit walk straight into a wall backstage. The police dismissed most of it as superstition. Still, the case file included a curious note: recommend structural survey, possible hidden access points. And here's where the story grows darker. Because when the building's blueprints were pulled, something didn't add up. The schematics from 1911 showed a side stairwell behind the curtains, yet no such stairwell existed by 1958. It had been bricked over, erased from memory. Had Robert found it? Had someone led him through? Or had the theater itself swallowed him whole? By the time dawn broke, officers were exhausted, journalists were rabid for headlines, and the audience members stumbled home with wide eyes and nervous laughter. But one seat in row G remained stained with unease, an empty coat still draped across the armrest, like its owner might return at any moment. Robert Klein never did. The morning after Robert Klein's disappearance, the newspapers ran wild. The New York Herald called it the vanishing seat. The Daily Mirror printed a grainy photograph of the empty chair in row G, popcorn kernels scattered like bones around it. Neighbors whispered about Robert as though he had already become a ghost, and detectives, meanwhile, began the painstaking task of interviewing nearly every one of the 600 patrons who had attended the show. Among the dozens of routine testimonies, one account stood out: a young couple seated 3 rows behind Robert. Their names were Irene and Harold Phelps, college students from Queens, who had scraped together enough money for a night on the town. They both insisted they saw something strange right before Robert vanished. Irene's voice trembled when she spoke to detectives. I don't know how to put it, a flicker like the projector jumped. But it wasn't the movie. It was like a person was standing on the screen in the shadows, tall, pale, not part of the film, for just a second. Then when I looked back at the seats, that man was gone. Harold nodded, though he admitted he wasn't as certain. Could have been a trick of the light, he muttered. But Irene's conviction etched itself into the record. When detectives replayed the film reel later that day, nothing unusual appeared: no figure, no missing frames. Yet theater staff swore there had been a brief flicker, a hiccup in the reel at exactly 9:15 p.m. Could Irene have genuinely seen something, or had her mind filled in the gap left by confusion and fear? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this kind of eyewitness testimony reflects real anomalies or the well known fragility of human memory under stress. And yet, Irene wasn't alone. Another patron, a retired school teacher, said she noticed Robert lean forward right before he disappeared, as if he was listening to someone whispering in his ear. But when asked to describe the someone, she hesitated. I couldn't see anyone there, just shadows. Those shadows became the story's heartbeat. Reporters flocked to the Empire Palace and demanded to sit in row G. They snapped photos of the screen, The curtains, the aisles. Some swore that when they developed the film, faint shapes appeared in the background, blurs that looked human, but not quite. The theater manager, a stout man named Gerald Haskins, insisted it was nonsense. He gave interviews, puffing cigars, and promising that the theater was perfectly safe. People don't vanish into thin air, he told reporters. Mr. Klein must have slipped out unnoticed, but his words rang hollow. Every exit had been checked that night. Ushers had stood by the doors watching. No one had seen Robert leave. And then came the first rumor. Someone whispered that the Empire Palace had been built on top of an older structure, a boarding house where a fire had killed half a dozen tenants in the late 1800s. Supposedly, their bodies were never recovered, their remains sealed under the foundation. The story spread quickly, even though no official record could confirm it. But in the court of public opinion, it only deepened the theater's dark allure. The police, desperate to anchor their investigation in something solid, requested the original blueprints of the building. They wanted to test whether there were hidden compartments, forgotten exits, or concealed staircases. When the dusty rolls of paper arrived at the precinct, the discrepancies leapt out. On the blueprint from 1911, a stairwell connected the main auditorium to a side alley, but in the modern day theater, that stairwell no longer existed. What had happened to it? Was it sealed, destroyed, or quietly maintained as a secret passage? Meanwhile, Robert Klein's family grew frantic. His younger sister, Margaret, begged the police for answers, clutching her brother's abandoned wristwatch in her hands. He wouldn't just leave. She said he was steady, predictable. That's what made him Robert. Someone took him. Someone was there in that theater. Detectives tried to reassure her, but in private, they admitted they were baffled. Missing persons usually left a trail: a last phone call, a financial transaction, a note. Robert left nothing. His bank account sat untouched, his apartment neat and unremarkable. His co-workers at the bank described him as diligent, quiet, and punctual, the kind of man, one said, who wouldn't miss work even if he was sick. Yet here he was, missing. The press, of course, fed the fire. Some painted Robert as a victim of gangsters spirited away because he had witnessed something he shouldn't. Others spun ghost stories about the cursed balcony and the whispers in the rafters. One tabloid even ran a sensational illustration: Robert being pulled into the silver screen by ghostly hands, his scream frozen forever in black and white. What really haunted the detectives, though, was the timing. That flicker at 9:15 p.m., so brief, so easy to dismiss, lined up with the stopped wristwatch found under Robert's seat, both frozen at the same instant, like the world itself had hiccuped. Was it a coincidence, or was something far more orchestrated unfolding inside the Empire Palace? The witnesses could not agree, but the shadows lingered. And as investigators dug deeper, the Empire Palace began to feel less like a theater and more like a trap. By Monday morning, the Empire Palace Theater was no longer just a cinema, it was a crime scene. Police cars lined the curb, their red domes pulsing against the neon marquee, while detectives in rumpled suits combed through aisles littered with candy wrappers and cigarette stubs. The theater smelled of stale popcorn and disinfectant, and the eerie quiet made it feel more like a morgue than a place of entertainment. Detective Frank Malloy, a broad shouldered veteran with 20 years on the force, led the search.
He'd worked homicides, robberies, even mob hits, but never something as peculiar as a man evaporating from a locked room with 600 witnesses. We're treating it like a crime until proven otherwise. He barked to his team. So check every corner, every bolt, every damn bag of popcorn if you have to. Uniformed officers swept the lobby, shining flashlights into coat closets and the storage rooms. Others pried open trap doors beneath the stage, expecting to find ladders, tunnels, or at least a dusty crawl space. Nothing. The only things they uncovered were cobwebs, rusty nails, and a forgotten broom. One rookie cop even climbed into the projection booth, expecting maybe a hidden passage. Instead, he found reels stacked haphazardly, cigarette butts ground into the floor, and a projectionist who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Earl Parsons, thin and hollow eyed, insisted he had no idea what happened. I thread film, he muttered. That's all I do. I don't make people disappear.
Still officers noted something odd, a stack of film reels in the corner, none labeled as though they didn't belong to the theater's catalog. Earl claimed they were old shorts from the 1930s, but when asked to demonstrate, he shook his head and refused. They're broken, he whispered. Best to leave 'em be. Malloy, unimpressed, tagged the reels for evidence. The aisles of the auditorium were next. Detectives crawled between rows with flashlights peering beneath seats. They found Robert Klein's coat, his wristwatch, and the half-eaten box of milk duds. No wallet, no ticket stub. Odd, since Robert was described as habitually neat, the kind of man who folded his receipts and placed them in his breast pocket. More peculiar still, the underside of Robert's seat bore a faint smear of ash, as if something had been burned there. The fire inspector who accompanied Malloy confirmed it wasn't cigarette ash. Too fine, he said, rubbing it between his fingers. Almost like film stock. Malloy frowned. The connection between the flickering reel, the stopwatch, and this strange ash gnawed at him. But in 1958, the NYPD didn't have the forensic tools we take for granted today. They couldn't run DNA or digital imaging. They relied on shoe leather witness statements and hunches. So Malloy did the most practical thing he could. He stationed officers at every possible exit and ordered a 24-hour guard on the building. If Robert had somehow hidden himself inside, or if an accomplice returned, they'd be caught. But 2 nights passed, and the Empire Palace remained silent. What the officers did hear, however, unsettled them. One night, a guard swore he heard applause from the empty auditorium. Another claimed the projector started on its own, whirring to life in the booth, despite no one touching it. Investigators and detective are still debating whether these reports were the result of exhaustion and paranoia, or whether something more tangible occurred.
Meanwhile, the search broadened. Malloy and his men canvassed the neighborhood, questioning shopkeepers, cab drivers, and late night diners. Had anyone seen Robert after the show? Not a soul. The city was thick with bodies, yet Robert had melted away without a ripple. At the precinct, the pressure mounted. The commissioner demanded progress, the press demanded headlines, and Robert's sister Margaret demanded answers. She appeared daily at the station, her hands trembling as she unfolded newspaper clippings. That's his seat, she whispered, pointing to the photos. He was right there. Something happened to him. You just have to look harder. Malloy believed her, but he also knew there was only so much harder they could look. By Thursday, frustration boiled over. Detectives began to consider the impossible. Could Robert have staged his own disappearance? His bank account, his job at the bank, his quiet life, it all seemed so ordinary. But maybe ordinary was the mask. Maybe Robert was running from debts, enemies, or secrets. Then came a break or so, it seemed. An usher turned over the theater's ticket ledger, a thick book used to track sales. Malloy flipped through it and quickly spotted something wrong. On the night of Robert's disappearance, the ledger showed 612 tickets sold, yet the head usher swore the house only had 600 seats. Even accounting for staff passes, the numbers didn't add up. Someone had slipped in without a proper record, or perhaps someone had been erased. Malloy rubbed his temples. So we're not just chasing a ghost, he muttered. We're chasing a phantom guest. The realization reframed everything. If there had been one more person in the building, then accounted for that person could have led Robert away, or worse. The locked theater no longer seemed sealed, it seemed rigged. And if that was true, Then the mystery wasn't about how Robert Klein left. It was about who came in.
Detective Frank Malloy hated numbers, but now the numbers had become the loudest voice in the investigation. 612 tickets sold for a theater with 600 seats. On paper, it could have been a clerical error, a distracted usher miscounting while the lobby swelled with late arrivals. But to Malloy, the discrepancy felt heavier. In a locked room mystery, every digit mattered. The manager of the Empire Palace, Gerald Haskins, sat sweating in his office as detectives pressed him. The office smelled of stale cigars and old upholstery, the walls decorated with yellowing posters of past performances. Haskins was a round man with thinning hair and darting eyes, the kind who smiled wide for reporters but deflated under direct questions. Malloy slapped the ledger onto his desk. Explain this, he demanded. 600 seats, 612 tickets. Where'd the extras go? Haskins puffed his cheeks. It's nothing, detective. Happens all the time. Standing room. Standing room doesn't exist in your house. Malloy cut him off. Not since the fire code changes in 47. The manager swallowed. His fingers drummed nervously against the blotter. Then maybe the usher miswrote. These kids, half the time, they don't know which way is up. But Malloy noticed the ledger entries were in two different hands. Most were scrawled in the messy ink of a hurried cashier, but a few those around the missing night were neat, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Two people logging sales, Malloy asked. Haskins stammered, sometimes yes. If the box office girl is sick, someone fills in, that's all. Yet Malloy's instincts screamed otherwise. He'd seen plenty of sloppy bookkeeping before, but this felt intentional, like someone was planting breadcrumbs that led nowhere. When news of the ledger leaked, the press jumped on it. Headlines screamed mystery guest. At theater of vanishing columnists speculated wildly. Was Robert lured by this extra guest? Was it a phantom patron who sat down beside him, invisible to everyone else? The public ate it up, and business at the Empire Palace paradoxically boomed. Crowds lined up for tickets just to sit in the cursed row, as if daring the shadows to swallow them too. Malloy, meanwhile, dug deeper into the theater's history. He discovered that the Empire Palace had changed ownership 3 times in the past decade, each time under murky circumstances. Former managers had gone bankrupt, fled the city, or died unexpectedly. Records were patchy, but one thing stood out: every manager seemed to leave debts behind. Haskins was no different. A quiet check with the department's organized crime bureau revealed whispers of unpaid loans to small time gangsters. If true, that debt could explain his evasiveness. Perhaps the phantom ticket was a cover up, a way to skim cash or launder money through fake entries. Still, that didn't explain Robert Klein's disappearance. Unless, Malloy thought grimly, Robert wasn't random at all. Maybe he'd stumbled into something bigger, an accounting trick, a payoff, or a secret meeting masked by the noise of a Saturday crowd. There was one unusual detail. Malloy couldn't shake a single ticket stub found in the trash that night. Unlike the others, it wasn't stamped by the box office machine. Instead, the number was written in pencil. Detectives photographed it and bagged it as evidence. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this stub represented the phantom guest or whether it was just a scrap left by sloppy staff. But in a mystery like this, even pencil marks felt like fingerprints. Malloy pushed harder on Haskins. You ever notice anyone hanging around Klein that night, talking to him, sitting near him? The manager shook his head vigorously. I didn't see a thing. I was too busy keeping the lobby under control. Saturday nights are madness. But later, when Malloy checked the statements of staff, one usher mentioned something odd. I saw Mr. Haskins slip into the auditorium around 9, the usher said. He usually stays in the lobby, but that night he went inside only for a minute. When he came back out, he looked pale. When confronted, Haskins denied it, but the crack was showing. By the end of the week, the ledger had become the case's central artifact, not just a record of ticket sales, but a possible map of lies. Malloy pinned the photocopied pages to the squad room wall lines of ink like trails through a maze. Somewhere in that maze lay Robert Klein, or the man who made him vanish. And as Malloy stared at the mismatched handwriting, the penciled stub, and the unexplained extra guest, a thought crept in, cold and unwelcome. What if the theater wasn't just a place of entertainment? What if it was being used quietly as a front for something else? The Empire Palace might not have been a stage for actors anymore. It might have been a stage for crime. The balcony of the Empire Palace had always carried whispers, long before Robert Klein ever stepped into Row G. Built in 1911, it was a two-tiered design with an upper gallery that locals half-jokingly called the Crow's Nest. Poorer patrons bought those cheaper seats where the air grew stuffy, and the view of the screen was obstructed by ornate railings and cigarette smoke. But the balcony had its own story, darker than cracked plaster and creaking boards. In 1937, a section of the balcony railing gave way during a packed matinee, sending three patrons tumbling onto the main floor.
Two were killed instantly, their bodies broken on the backs of seats below. The third lingered in a hospital for weeks before dying of his injuries. The theater had been closed for 6 months afterward for repairs, and when it reopened, the management quietly avoided mentioning the incident, but the stain never washed out. Locals swore the balcony was cursed, and ushers avoided working up there alone. By 1958, those whispers had hardened into legend. If you sit in the balcony, one teenager told reporters, you hear the dead clapping along with the show. Another patron swore that she once felt someone tugging her sleeve when the row behind her was empty. The police dismissed these stories as superstition, but Malloy knew better than to ignore them. Legends cling to places for reasons, even if those reasons are buried in dust and brick. So when Robert Klein vanished from Row G, it was only natural that rumors spread upward.
It came from the balcony, Irene Phelps insisted again when interviewed a second time. The flicker, the shadow, I'm telling you, it was above him before it was gone. Malloy assigned two detectives to comb the balcony inch by inch. They crawled beneath the seats, tapped the walls, even unscrewed vent covers. They found nothing unusual, just dust thick enough to choke on and graffiti etched into the wooden backs of chairs, Hart's initials, crude jokes carved by restless teenagers. Yet one piece of graffiti stood out. It read simply, "Not an accident." The words were deep etched with force, and when the detectives checked the wood grain, they concluded it was at least 20 years old. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this graffiti was just a prank carved after the 37 collapse, or whether someone knew more about the supposed accident than they ever admitted. But the most unsettling detail came not from the detectives, but from an elderly usher named Howard Lasky. He had worked the palace for decades and claimed he was on duty the day of the collapse. Those folks didn't fall, he said quietly. They were pushed, not by a man, not by anything you'd see, by pressure, like the air itself shoved them forward. Malloy raised an eyebrow, but Howard's pale eyes didn't blink. Ever since then, the usher added, the balcony's been wrong. Cold spots where no draft should be. Sounds of people standing when there's no one there. And now this Klein fellow vanishes from right below it. Don't tell me it's not connected. The manager Haskins brushed it off. The man's senile, he said. He's telling ghost stories because it makes him feel important. But Malloy didn't dismiss Howard so quickly. The man's recollection had the weight of a lived memory, not cheap invention. One strange detail reinforced the usher's words. The floorboards of the balcony, when stepped on, gave off faint metallic creaks. When a carpenter was called in to inspect, he discovered why. Beneath the wooden flooring, instead of standard supports, there were steel beams welded crudely to older mismatched ones. Repairs from the 37 collapse had been rushed, corners cut, hidden beneath plaster and paint. They were patching something they didn't want people to see, the carpenter muttered. Could there have been more? Beneath the balcony, hidden passages, sealed rooms, forgotten structures. Malloy ordered city archives to pull the original building permits. Sure enough, the 1911 plans listed an auxiliary stairwell from the balcony leading to a side alley. But in every modern inspection since 1940, that stairwell simply didn't exist, just like the missing stairwell behind the stage, another bricked over artery in the palace's anatomy. The idea gnawed at Malloy. The theater seemed riddled with the scars, erased passageways that once led somewhere now sealed like crypts. If Robert had been taken or had stumbled through one of them, that could explain the impossible vanishing act. Still, for the public, the balcony whispers remained louder than logic. Patrons who dared sit up there after Klein's disappearance claimed to hear faint sobbing in the rafters. Others said they felt watched, as if unseen eyes stared down from the shadows. And when one photographer tried to capture the cursed seats, his negatives developed into gray blurs streaked with what looked like handprints. The press, of course, devoured it. Headlines shouted, "Balcony," "Curse claims new victim," "Supernatural angles," sold papers, and the Empire Palace became a curiosity piece rather than just a crime scene. Malloy loathed it, but he couldn't ignore the effect.
People now entered the palace not in fear, but with morbid excitement, as though the theater itself was daring them to tempt fate. For every skeptic, there was someone who swore the balcony whispered when the lights dimmed, and Malloy had to admit when he stood there himself in the empty theater late at night, the silence of the balcony pressed on him, heavy, watching. If the balcony whispered, then the projector roared. At least that was the impression Malloy had the first time he stood in the projection booth watching the reels spin like hypnotic wheels. The machine hummed with mechanical precision, its beams slicing through dust and cigarette smoke, carrying flickers of light that created whole worlds on the silver screen. But on the night Robert Klein vanished, that world had faltered. Every witness who mentioned the disappearance pointed back to the same moment, 9:15 p.m., a flicker in the film. 2 frames, maybe 3, something not quite right. Yet when the reel was inspected, no damage showed. The film was smooth, no scratches, no burn marks. By all accounts, it was a flawless print of the final alibi. But Malloy wasn't satisfied. He ordered the reel replayed in its entirety under police supervision. In the empty theater, officers sat in the dim light, watching the movie that might have hidden a crime. The film rolled steadily. For the first hour, cops in fedoras, cigarette smoke, alleyway shadows. Then at the precise timestamp of 9:15, the picture jumped. It wasn't a skipped frame. It wasn't even damage. It was an intrusion. For less than half a second, a different image flashed onto the screen, a corridor narrow and bricked, illuminated by a swinging light bulb. The perspective was tilted as though the camera had been dropped or held at an odd angle. Then it was gone, replaced instantly by the ongoing movie. The officers blinked. Some weren't even sure what they had seen. Malloy demanded they rewind. Again, the corridor appeared only 4 frames long, so brief it seemed like a trick of the eye, but it was there. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this splice was an intentional message, a prank, or a technical error that defies explanation. The film experts called in to examine the reel had mixed opinions. One argued the corridor frames must have been spliced in deliberately. Another insisted it could have been a lab mistake, a remnant from a previously developed reel, but none could explain why such an anomaly coincided exactly with the time Robert Klein vanished. And that wasn't all. When the corridor frames were projected again, Malloy noticed something unsettling. In the corner of the image, just barely visible in the grain, was a figure, a faceless silhouette, half hidden by shadow, standing at the end of the corridor, as though waiting. The discovery rattled even the most skeptical officers. They bagged the reel as evidence and sent it for forensic analysis. Meanwhile, Malloy questioned Earl Parsons, the projectionist, again. Earl had been evasive before, but now confronted with proof of tampering, he crumbled. "I didn't put it there," Earl stammered. His hands shook as he lit another cigarette. "But I've seen things before. Splices that weren't supposed to be there. Faces in blank frames. Sometimes I hear whispers when the reel spins, like the film's talking back." Malloy scowled. "Talking back." Earl nodded furiously. "Like it's alive, like the screen wants something from us." To anyone else, it would have sounded like lunacy, but Malloy filed it away. The man had been alone in the booth for years. If someone had tampered with the reels, he was either involved or a terrified witness. The anomaly sparked a frenzy in the press. Reporters labeled it the ghost splice. Newspapers ran illustrations of haunted corridors projected onto screens, claiming the palace was a gateway between worlds. Cinemagoers whispered about cursed reels that trapped souls inside celluloid, and yet one undeniable fact remained: someone had physically tampered with the film. The corridor existed, caught on camera, and whoever spliced it in had access to the projection booth. That narrowed the suspect list to staff or insiders. Malloy had the corridor stills printed and distributed among the team. "This place," he said, tapping the grainy bricks, "exists somewhere in this city. Find it." Detectives canvassed basements, alleys, and storage tunnels across Midtown, searching for the bricked corridor with its dangling light. None matched exactly, but a few led to odd discoveries: sealed speakeasies from the Prohibition era, shuttered stairwells under old hotels, and maintenance passages hidden from the public. The Empire Palace itself seemed the likeliest candidate.
Its sealed exits and brick stairwells mirrored the corridor's appearance too well to ignore. Malloy began to suspect that whoever had spliced the footage was leaving breadcrumbs, taunting them with images of hidden places within the very theater they searched. Margaret Klein Roberts' sister was shown the still images. Her face went pale. "That's Robert's worst nightmare," she whispered. "He hated tight spaces, couldn't even ride elevators without panicking. If he saw that place, he wouldn't have gone there willingly." So if Robert was taken into that corridor, he hadn't walked, he'd been forced. Late one night, Malloy sat alone in the auditorium, staring at the still frames projected large across the screen. The faceless silhouette at the corridor's end seemed to stare back, patient and mocking, and Malloy wondered, not for the first time, if the Empire Palace was less a theater than a labyrinth, its walls stitched with forgotten pathways. But the most chilling thought crept in with the silence. What if the splice wasn't just a clue left by a criminal? What if it was a recording of what really happened that night, captured not outside the film, but within it? Earl Parsons was the kind of man who blended into wallpaper. Thin shoulders, nicotine stained fingers, eyes that never seemed to meet yours for more than a second. He'd been working at the Empire Palace projection booth since 1946, long enough for his face to become part of the machinery. To most, he was invisible, like the reels themselves, present only when the light flared onto the screen. But the splice changed that. Suddenly, Earl wasn't just a tired technician running reels for romance flicks and gangster dramas. He was a suspect. Malloy called him into the precinct again. The detective watched the projectionist fidget across the table, crumpling his hat in his hands. Earl Malloy began in that slow, measured voice he used when cornering men.
We've got 4 frames spliced into a print, a corridor, some shadow, maybe even a figure. That doesn't happen by magic. Someone did it, and you're the one with access. Earl shook his head violently. Detective, I swear on my mother's grave. I didn't put it there. He swallowed hard, knuckles whitening around his hat. But I've seen things I don't tell folks because they'd think I've gone soft in the head. Malloy leaned forward. Try me. So Earl spoke. His voice cracked with the weight of confession. He told of reels that sometimes arrived with missing seconds, blank frames that flickered with faces when he slowed them down. He described whispers in the booth when the machine whirred at night, voices asking questions in tones too faint to understand. Sometimes he said, I swear I see people in the film who ain't supposed to be there. Extras, I guess. Men in hallways, women staring into the camera, but they vanish when the reel speeds back up. Malloy arched an eyebrow.
Hallucinations, maybe Earl admitted, but that corridor, I've seen it before, long before Robert Klein disappeared. It's shown up in reels now and then, like some ghost that won't quit haunting the celluloid. The detective scribbled in his notebook, but kept his doubts to himself. Still, one detail clung. If Earl wasn't lying, then the corridor footage had been drifting across different reels for years. And if that was true, someone had been planting it long before this disappearance. Earl then revealed a stranger memory. A couple of weeks back, before the Klein fellow went missing, I was up in the booth and I heard a knock right on the glass, but the balcony was empty. When I looked back at the screen, the movie'd frozen, just stopped. And for a second, the corridor was there plain as day, not just 4 frames, a whole 10 seconds. He rubbed his face, trembling, and at the end of it, I swear I saw Robert Klein standing in that hallway like he was waiting for something. Malloy stared, trying to separate madness from truth. The idea of a reel predicting a man's disappearance was absurd, but then again, wasn't the entire case absurd? A man vanishing in front of dozens without a trace, only to be followed by film splices that no one could explain. Word of Earl's testimony spread. The press ate it alive. Phantom projectionist hears voices, screamed one headline. Ghosts splice clues into film reels, claimed another. The Empire Palace became a magnet for the curious lining up at the ticket booth just to say they'd sat in the cursed auditorium. But beneath the sensationalism, one kernel of truth gnawed at Malloy, the bricked over exit behind the curtains. Earl had worked there for decades. He must have known about it. When asked, Earl admitted sheepishly that he did. They sealed it after the war, he muttered, said it was unsafe, but I always figured it led somewhere. Old tunnels, maybe. A lot of these buildings in the city, they're like Swiss cheese under the floorboards. Whole passages folks forgot about. Malloy seized on that detail. If Robert had been taken, or if he'd somehow stumbled into a hidden passage, the corridor splice might not be a supernatural clue at all. It might be a photographic record of one of those forgotten tunnels. The detective ordered a search of the bricked exit, but the building manager resisted. Too costly, too dangerous, the man whined. You'll collapse the stage supports. Malloy didn't care. He had already filed paperwork for demolition approval. The exit would be opened, and whatever lay behind it would finally see daylight again. Meanwhile, Margaret Klein pressed her own theory. She cornered Malloy in the precinct lobby, gripping his sleeve. Detective, don't you see someone lured Robert into that passage? They knew his fear of enclosed spaces. They used it against him. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Klein's disappearance was orchestrated by a criminal scheme or if it was somehow tied to stranger forces woven into the very reels of film. Malloy didn't answer her outright, but he felt the weight of her words. If this was a crime, the corridor footage was more than evidence. It was a message, perhaps even a confession. And if it was something else, that night, Malloy returned to the theater alone. He climbed the narrow staircase to the projection booth where Earl had left the machine humming quietly. The room smelled of oil and smoke. He pressed play on the reel. The corridor flashed again, 4 frames long. Malloy leaned closer, and just before the cut ended, he saw the silhouette tilt its head, a subtle movement, but deliberate, as if acknowledging his presence. For the first time in years, Malloy felt his chest tighten. He was being watched, not by Earl, not by any suspect, but by something hidden in the film itself.
The Empire Palace was built in 1919, back when grandeur meant sweeping marble foyers, velvet curtains, and gilded arches that glittered in candlelight. But buildings age, and in New York, they age fast. By 1958, much of its opulence had dulled into cracked plaster and peeling gold leaf. Still beneath the showy stage and the endless rows of seats lay something far more interesting, a skeleton of brick and steel riddled with hidden exits. Malloy had always trusted buildings less than people. At least people pretended to be honest. Buildings lied with silence. They hid hallways, buried stairwells, sealed doors, and the Empire Palace was no exception. The bricked over exit stood behind the heavy stage curtains, tall enough to have once been a proper doorway, now reduced to a rough scar of mismatched brick. Malloy stood before it one early morning as workers swung hammers and chisels, breaking through dust and mortar.
Each clang rang out across the empty theater like the countdown of a clock. By the third strike, the dust shifted oddly. A hollow thud echoed. Malloy stepped closer. Stop! Right there! He tapped the bricks with the butt of his flashlight. Solid, solid, then hollow. They broke through, carefully, chisels chipping, until the first brick fell inward, revealing blackness. A rush of stale air seeped out, carrying the sour tang of mildew and coal dust. Malloy flicked on his light and peered inside. It wasn't just a wall, it was a tunnel. The passage sloped downward, lined with red bricks darkened by age. Wooden beams reinforced the ceiling every few feet, many warped and rotting. The air was thick, heavy. He could almost hear the years humming in the silence. Used to be a fire exit. Back when codes were different, one of the workers muttered. They sealed a lot of these after the 30s. Too many vagrants slipping in. Malloy nodded, though his mind turned elsewhere. This was the corridor. It matched the splice. Same bricked walls, same claustrophobic narrowness. The dangling bulb was gone now, but the rusted socket remained in the ceiling wires, dangling like veins. He stepped inside, every footfall stirring echoes that seemed to whisper down the dark. Halfway down, he stopped. On the wall, faint but undeniable, were scratches. Human scratches, parallel grooves where fingernails had raked against brick. Some trailed low, as if a person had stumbled while clawing desperately for escape. Margaret Klein's words echoed in his head. Robert hated enclosed spaces. He would never go here willingly. Malloy traced the marks with his fingers, the brick rough beneath his skin. He fought, he murmured. He fought hard. The tunnel bent left, then ended abruptly at another wall of brick. This one looked older, sturdier, reinforced with iron rods. Beyond it, silence pressed like a weight. They tried knocking, listening, no hollow echo this time. Whatever lay beyond had been sealed decades ago. But Malloy knew what he saw. Someone had dragged Robert into this passage, forced him down into the dark, then vanished him behind a wall that no longer led anywhere. Word of the discovery leaked fast. Reporters painted it as proof of a haunted theater, calling it the sealed mouth of the building that swallowed patrons whole. Locals whispered that Robert's body must still be behind that second wall. Some said his ghost roamed the aisles looking for a way back into the light, but the facts were stranger than fiction. Forensics swept the passage and found something unexpected, not a body, but scraps of film, tiny fragments of 35 millimeter celluloid, brittle and yellowed with age. Some still bore faint images, unidentifiable figures, blurred hallways, lights swaying in darkness. The lab couldn't date the scraps precisely, but they were old, older than Robert Klein's disappearance.
Which meant the corridor footage wasn't just spliced into the final alibi. For the first time, it had existed long before. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these fragments were left by pranksters decades earlier or if they're evidence of some ongoing pattern of vanishings tied to the theater itself. Malloy stood in the passage alone that night, flashlight beam cutting across the scratches, the socket, the fragments bagged in evidence. He imagined Robert shoved down here in panic, gasping for air in the dark. He imagined someone dragging him further, maybe through a hidden panel, maybe deeper underground. And for a fleeting moment, Malloy swore he heard movement, not rats, not pipes shifting, but something slower, a shuffling, a foot dragging against stone. He turned sharply, light darting across the bricks. Nothing, just the long, suffocating throat of the passage. Still, he backed out carefully, one step at a time, until he was back under the stage lights. He didn't tell the others what he heard. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. But as he looked back at the bricked doorway, he knew this much: the Empire Palace hadn't given up all its secrets yet. And if Robert Klein had truly gone into that passage, then the answer to his disappearance lay deeper still. Theater people are strange people. That's what Malloy thought as he sat in a dim cafe near Broadway, listening to a group of jittery actors whisper about phantom auditions. They weren't on record, not officially. These were the kinds of stories that lived in cigarette smoke and late night rumors trading hands like contraband. But when a man vanishes in the middle of a film and a bricked corridor turns up in the same building, suddenly every rumor earns an audience. The story went like this for years. Actors had been lured by mysterious casting calls. Handbills appeared on bulletin boards, slips of paper tucked into scripts, even small newspaper classifieds. Auditions for new picture Empire Palace Theater, one night shoot, great opportunity, always vague, never tied to a studio anyone recognized, and those who answered some never returned. Malloy had heard enough superstition by now to roll his eyes, but the coincidences piled up. Margaret Klein had mentioned Robert occasionally dabbling in amateur acting. He wasn't serious, just community productions and background roles, but it was plausible. A casting call promising film work could have drawn him into the palace willingly. He tracked down a woman named Clara Jameson, a singer who'd once answered one of these phantom ads. She sat nervously across from him in her walk-up apartment, twisting a handkerchief. They told me it was for a short film, she said, her voice low. Said it was experimental. I showed up one night late after the last show had ended. The lobby was empty, but a man met me at the stage door. Tall hat pulled low. He didn't give his name, just said, "Follow me." Malloy urged her on. He led me through the wings down a set of stairs I'd never seen before. It didn't look like part of the theater anymore, more like a cellar. There was a camera, old-fashioned, and a single light bulb swinging. He told me to stand in front of the wall and read some lines he handed me, but the lines didn't make sense. They weren't dialogue. They were directions, like step left, step closer, look into the dark. Her voice trembled. I left, ran right out. He didn't stop me, just stood there still. I never went back. Malloy pressed, "Did you ever see that corridor again? The one from the splice." Clara's face went pale. She nodded. "Yes, that's it. That's the wall I stood in front of. The bricks, the shadows. That's where he wanted me to look." It was confirmation, at least in part, that someone had been staging these auditions inside the palace. And Robert, with his mild curiosity for acting, might have been caught up in one. Still others denied it outright.
A rival theater manager scoffed when asked. Phantom auditions. That's nothing more than backstage gossip. Half these kids want an excuse when they don't get hired. They disappear into booze or skip town. They don't vanish into walls. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these so called phantom auditions were a criminal recruitment scheme, an elaborate prank, or evidence of something far darker lurking beneath the Empire Palace. Yet the paper trail intrigued Malloy. He pulled old classifieds from library archives. Sure enough, cryptic ads for one-night shoots appeared sporadically across the last decade, always tied vaguely to Empire. Sometimes the address was half right, sometimes just implied. And in the months before Robert Klein's disappearance, 3 such ads had been placed. It was a pattern, clear as the flicker of a film reel. Someone had been fishing for victims, using the theater as bait. Malloy returned to the palace with fresh eyes. He stood in the wings near the stage door, imagining Robert being led down into the dark. He could almost hear the phantom director's instructions: step left, step closer, look into the dark. The bricked corridor, the film spliced the auditions, they were all connected. But the missing link was motive. Why lure someone under the guise of acting only to make them vanish? What was being filmed down there? Later that week, one of Malloy's men brought him a fragment of rumor turned fact. A pawn shop downtown had received a battered film canister weeks earlier, sold by a man matching Earl's description. Inside were a few reels of damaged footage, mostly nonsense, blurred shots of walls, ceilings, and vacant rooms. But in the middle of one reel, Malloy saw something that made his skin prickle. Robert Klein, standing in the corridor, his face pale, his eyes wide, staring directly into the camera.
And then, like Clara described, he stepped closer into shadow before the reel burned out into static. Malloy sat in silence after watching it, the reel clicking at its end. Whatever this was, it wasn't superstition anymore. Robert hadn't just vanished. He'd been filmed doing it. The Empire Palace had always been a palace in name only. By the late 50s, it was a bleeding business. Ticket sales dropped. Maintenance slipped and bills piled like snowdrifts. At the center of it all was theater manager Harold Brackett, a man with slicked hair, a quick smile, and a suit that smelled faintly of gin even at 10 in the morning. Malloy had suspected Brackett from the start, but suspicion isn't the same as proof. Now with the phantom auditions, the corridor splice, and Robert Klein's film Terror, the manager's shadow loomed larger. Brackett sat behind his desk when Malloy stormed in a ledger open before him. The detective dropped a stack of pawnshop photographs on the blotter. "Recognize him?" Robert's pale face stared up from the still frame, caught mid-flinch. Brackett's eyes flicked over the photo and then away. "Never seen him." Malloy slammed his fist. "Don't play dumb. Your theater's crawling with secrets, sealed exits, spliced reels, phantom auditions. And now we've got film of Klein standing in your walls." Brackett licked his lips, his hand tightening around his fountain pen. The facade cracked. The truth came in fragments pried loose by threats of jail. Brackett owed money. Not a little either, a lot. The palace was deep in debt to local crime outfits, men who saw struggling theaters as perfect laundries for dirty cash. When the numbers didn't add up, pressure came down hard. "You think I wanted this?" Brackett hissed. "I didn't have a choice. They wanted the theater, wanted the tunnels, said it was perfect for moving things under the city without the cops sniffing. All I had to do was look the other way. Malloy's jaw tightened.
And the auditions bracket hesitated. His voice dropped low. That wasn't my idea. That was theirs. They said they needed faces, extras for their little films, but I never asked what kind. I just posted the ads they gave me, paid cash, no questions. Malloy pressed harder, and Robert Klein Brackett shook his head. I didn't know the man, but I know he answered one of those calls. They said he was perfect, easy to lead, nervous type. He showed up that night, and he swallowed. I never saw him again. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Brackett's confession was full truth, half truth, or just another desperate lie to save his skin. But the pieces aligned too neatly. The debts, the gangs, the ads, it all pointed to something criminal masquerading as supernatural. The film splice wasn't a haunting, it was evidence of a racket, and Robert Klein was collateral. Malloy demanded names. Brackett gave a few low level enforcers, men with broken noses and thick accents, but one name stood out: Vincent Morelli, a mid tier gangster with a known taste for theatrics. Morelli had dabbled in producing independent films, most of them fronts for smuggling operations. If anyone had reason to lure men into a bricked corridor and put them on camera, it was him. The detective walked out of the palace that night with fire in his veins. He didn't buy all of Brackett's story. There were gaps, evasions, but one fact rang clear: Robert Klein hadn't vanished into thin air. He'd been pulled into a scheme run by men who treated lives like props and tunnels like backlot stages. Outside, Margaret Klein waited in the cold. She clutched her coat tighter as Malloy approached. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her eyes hollow. Malloy didn't tell her everything. Not yet. He just said, "Your brother was used, and I intend to find out by who."
That night, Malloy dreamed of film reels spinning endlessly strips of celluloid, dragging men into shadows while faceless figures watched. He woke in a sweat, the word extras echoing like a curse, because if Robert Klein was an extra in someone's production, what exactly was the final cut meant to show? They called it the Midnight Experiment. It wasn't official, not sanctioned by the city or approved by the precinct, but Malloy knew bureaucracy wouldn't solve the Klein case. He needed to catch the theater in the act, to see what happened when the palace was left to breathe in the dark. So he arranged it. Midnight, a controlled audience, hidden cameras, and a reel of the final alibi, the same movie Robert Klein had been watching when he vanished. The participants were a strange bunch: a few officers sworn to secrecy, two film technicians from the lab, and a handful of nervous volunteers bribed with cash. The palace had never felt emptier, its velvet seats swallowing shadows.
The place smelled of dust plaster and stale perfume. The projector hummed alive, throwing its first flicker across the silver screen. Malloy sat in the back row, notebook in hand, eyes sharp. He wanted answers. For the first 40 minutes, nothing. The movie played as it had for decades: detectives in fedoras, dames in trouble gunfire in alleys. The volunteers shifted uneasily, whispering. But then at exactly 12:15, the screen faltered, not just a flicker this time. The entire image stuttered. The corridor appeared again, but longer, 10 seconds, maybe more. Everyone in the room froze. The bricked walls, the dangling socket, the same claustrophobic tilt. And then, for the first time, the figure moved. A silhouette stepped forward into the light, closer, closer, until its faceless head tilted toward the audience. One of the volunteers screamed. The projector whirred violently, then jammed. Film flapped and tore, burning in the gate. The screen went white.
In the chaos, Malloy noticed something else. Row J, seat 7, empty. No one had sat there at the start, but now the seat rocked slightly. as if someone had just risen and slipped away. He sprinted down the aisle. Nothing, no figure, no intruder, just the faint scent of smoke lingering where no cigarette had been lit. The film technicians swore they hadn't tampered with the reel. They'd threaded it clean. Yet when they examined the burned strip, the corridor frames weren't there anymore, just blank exposure. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the experiment proved the existence of tampered reels, mass hallucination, or something more paranormal that defies conventional explanation. The officers muttered nervously. One refused to sit back down, claiming he'd seen Robert Klein himself in the corridor, his face pressed against the wall, begging silently for help. Another swore the silhouette resembled someone else entirely, a tall man with a hat echoing Clara Jameson's description of the Phantom Director. Malloy didn't speak. He kept staring at the empty seat in row J, trying to reconcile what he'd witnessed. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in men with motives, but that rocking chair gnawed at him more than any superstition. After the crowd dispersed, Malloy stayed behind. He walked the aisles, slowly running his hand along the velvet backs. The silence pressed heavy, interrupted only by the faint creak of the projector cooling. On the stage, half buried in dust, near the bricked passage, he found something new, a matchbook, cheap stamped with the name Morelli's Social Club. Vincent Morelli again. The thread tightened. Malloy pocketed it and lit a cigarette, staring at the blank screen. Whatever the midnight experiment had revealed, it wasn't closure. It was escalation. The palace wasn't just a crime scene. It was a stage.
And someone somewhere was still running the show. The rain was relentless the next morning, hammering down on the city like it wanted to scrub it clean of secrets. Malloy sat hunched in his car outside Morelli's social club, staring at the peeling neon sign that sputtered weak light into the puddles below. He'd been here before years back, chasing bookies and loan sharks, but tonight the place had a different weight to it, a matchbook clue that had fallen from the cursed theater stage. He flicked his cigarette out the cracked window and stepped into the drizzle. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and fried onions. The bar hummed with low voices, gamblers hunched over dice and cards. No one looked up when he entered. Malloy ordered coffee from the bartender, an old man with eyes like tarnished coins. "I'm looking for Vincent Morelli," he said quietly. The bartender didn't flinch. "Nobody by that name here." Malloy slid the matchbook across the counter. "Funny. His club seems to think otherwise." A pause. The man sighed, poured the coffee, and jerked his head toward the back room. Malloy followed the gesture, pushing past a curtain heavy with cigar smoke. Vincent Morelli was there, older, heavier, but unmistakably the same man from the faded clippings about the Palace Theater's golden days. His pinstripe suit sagged on his frame, but his eyes were sharp, fox-like. "Well, well," Morelli rasped, setting down a glass of whiskey. "I wondered when the past would come knocking again." Malloy sat. "Your name keeps turning up at the palace. Care to explain why Robert Klein disappeared in your theater?" Morelli chuckled, but it wasn't humor. It was bitterness. "Disappeared. No detective. Robert Klein didn't disappear. He followed the script." Malloy frowned. "What script?" "The one that's been running since the theater opened. A script bigger than any of us. Every few decades, the palace demands its due. Actors, directors, audience, it doesn't matter. Someone vanishes. Someone always vanishes." Malloy leaned in. "You expect me to believe a building eats people?" Morelli's hand trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. "You think I built that place by chance? You think the bricked passage was just decoration? No detective. The palace was designed for sacrifice. That's why I sold it. Too much blood on my hands already." Malloy studied him carefully. The man sounded half mad, yet his words carried conviction. "Why Klein?" he pressed. Morelli exhaled smoke slowly. "Because he was chosen, or because he stepped into the wrong reel at the wrong time. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these vanishings were orchestrated by criminals or something darker bound into the palace's foundations." The back door slammed open, cutting the conversation short. A tall figure in a raincoat face, obscured by shadow, stood in the doorway. For a moment, Malloy thought it was coincidence.
Then he noticed the stillness of the man's stance, the way every gambler in the front room had gone silent. Morelli's face paled. "You brought him here," he hissed at Malloy. The man in the raincoat stepped forward. Malloy reached for his revolver, but before he could draw, the lights flickered. Just for a second, long enough to feel the same unnatural tug he'd felt in the theater. When the lights steadied, the doorway was empty. And so was Morelli's chair. Malloy's hand brushed the table, still warm, where Morelli had sat seconds ago. The glass of whiskey trembled, then tipped over, spilling into a spreading stain. The bartender's voice drifted from the front appens. "Every time somebody talks too much." Malloy walked out, shaking his coat damp with sweat instead of rain. For the first time in his career, he didn't know if he'd just witnessed a murder, a trick, or something beyond either. But the name of the game had changed. The palace wasn't just history, it was active.
It was hunting, and now Malloy knew he was next on the playbill. Malloy had never feared sleep before, but now, every time he closed his eyes, the screen returned. That same corridor, bricked walls, dim bulb, and the whisper of footsteps that weren't his. He woke each night, drenched in sweat, cigarette smoldering between his fingers, revolver on the nightstand as if it could shoot dreams. The morning after Morelli vanished, Malloy found himself back at the palace. The rain had gone, leaving the streets slick and glistening like black glass. The marquee hung crooked letters, rattling in the breeze, now playing the final alibi. He wasn't here officially anymore. The department was tired of him chasing ghosts, tired of burned reels and vanished mobsters. But Malloy couldn't shake it. The case had crawled into his bones. Inside the theater seemed different, colder. The bricked passage loomed like an open mouth. Malloy walked the rows, slowly, eyes scanning the seats.
Row J, seat 7, still rocking faintly, though the air was still. On the stage, fresh chalk marks lined the floor X's and arrows like stage directions. They hadn't been there the week before. Malloy crouched down, tracing one with his finger. The chalk was clean recent. Someone was rehearsing. He climbed onto the stage, moving toward the bricked passage, and then he saw it tucked under a loose floorboard, a stack of papers bound with string, a script. He opened it. The typewriter ink was faint but legible. Title: The Last Performance. Cast list: Robert Klein, Clara Jameson, Vincent Morelli. And at the bottom, Detective Francis Malloy. Malloy froze. He flipped through the pages, scanning the dialogue. The script described everything: the midnight experiment, the matchbook clue, the meeting with Morelli. Every scene he'd lived was written here, word for word. And then he reached the final page. Stage direction. Detective Malloy enters the bricked passage. He does not return.
The pages shook in his hands. He wasn't just investigating a mystery. He was living inside a script that had already been written. His mind raced. If the palace was writing reality, who was the author? Morelli Klein? Or something older bound to the theater itself? A sound echoed from the back row, soft clapping. Malloy whipped around, revolver drawn. A figure stood in the shadows, half hidden, tall and lean with a bowler hat tilted low. "Bravo, detective," the figure said, voice smooth and mocking. "You've finally read your lines." Malloy raised his gun. "Who are you?" The man stepped forward just enough for the stage lights to graze his face, though his features never seemed to settle, shifting like smoke, familiar yet ungraspable. Names don't matter. I'm the director. Malloy's hand trembled. You're the one taking them. The director smiled. Not taking, guiding. Every story needs a cast, every performance a sacrifice. Klein was good, but the audience always craves a fresh lead. The revolver felt suddenly useless heavy in Malloy's grip. His instincts screamed to pull the trigger, but another part of him knew it wouldn't matter. You couldn't shoot a script. The director tipped his hat. Don't worry, detective. You'll be remembered long after the curtain falls. The lights flickered. For an instant, Malloy saw the corridor projected across the theater walls, stretching out like a wound in reality. And he realized the chalk marks weren't random. They were blocking cues, directions for him. He stumbled back, clutching the script. If the story was already written, maybe he had one chance left to improvise, to change the ending. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Malloy uncovered a real criminal conspiracy or whether he fell into a theater of his own mind, a delusion scripted by obsession and sleepless nights. But Malloy wasn't debating, he was deciding.
For the first time in months, his case wasn't about Klein or Morelli. It was about whether he'd let the palace write his final scene. Malloy spent the night pacing his apartment, chain smoking until the ashtray overflowed. The script lay on his desk, taunting him with its inevitability. Every word was a trap, every direction a cage, but cages could be broken. He poured whiskey into a chipped glass and studied the final page again. Detective Malloy enters the bricked passage. He does not return. Not this time, he thought. Not if I can flip the reel. The next day, he returned to the palace with a new plan. He wasn't going to follow the script, he was going to tear it apart. The theater was silent when he entered sunlight, barely cutting through the boarded windows. The air held that faint perfume of mildew and plaster, but now it seemed thicker, like the building was holding its breath. Malloy walked down the aisle, deliberately resisting the pull toward row J, seat 7. He ignored it as if refusing to give the script what it wanted. On the stage, he unfolded the papers, scattering them across the floor. Page after page fluttered like dying birds. Tonight, he muttered, "We improvise." From his coat pocket, he pulled a reel of film, not the final alibi, but an old family home movie he'd taken from the police evidence locker, a reel no one had ever screened here. He threaded it into the projector hands, steady despite his hammering heart. The machine hummed to life. The beam lit up the screen. For the first time in decades, the palace wasn't showing its cursed corridor. Instead, flickering black and white images of children playing in a park, women in summer dresses, men laughing with baseball bats on their shoulders. Ordinary life, real life. And then something remarkable happened. The corridor began to blur faint at the edges of the screen, like it was struggling to overwrite itself. The bricked walls wavered, the dangling light bulbs sputtered. Malloy leaned forward, whispering, "Not your story anymore." But the theater didn't surrender easily. The screen tore itself down the middle, splicing both films together. On the left, children laughed in sunlight. On the right, Robert Klein appeared standing alone in the corridor, mouthing words Malloy couldn't hear. The audience seats creaked. Empty chairs groaned as if invisible figures were rising from them. Shadows stretched across the aisles, and then came the voice. The director's smooth tone echoing from everywhere at once. "You think you can outright me?" Malloy held his ground. Every performance can be rewritten. Every actor can go off script. The projector sputtered light, flashing wildly. The home movie reel began to burn, curling into ash. Malloy cursed, ripping it free before the fire could spread. But even in its destruction, it had proved something: the script wasn't invincible. It could be bent.
He grabbed the chalk from the stage, erasing the X's and arrows one by one, smearing white dust across his fingers. No more blocking, no more cues. The shadows hissed, recoiling. The corridor on the screen flickered violently. Robert Klein fading in and out like a broken transmission. Malloy shouted into the void, "If you want me, come get me." The brick passage yawned open wider than ever before, its darkness spilling into the theater like a tide. Malloy stepped to the edge, but stopped short. He wasn't going to enter on their terms. Instead, he dragged a seat from the front row onto the stage, sat down, and lit a cigarette. "Your move, director." The silence that followed was deafening. The palace itself seemed confused, as though the script had no line for this. For the first time, Malloy felt a sliver of control.
Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Malloy truly disrupted a cycle of vanishings or if his improvisation was simply madness in the face of an unstoppable pattern. But one thing was certain: the ending was no longer certain. And for Malloy, that uncertainty was the closest thing to victory he'd had in months. The palace wasn't finished. Malloy could feel it in the floorboards beneath his chair, the faint vibration of something waking, something angry. He puffed his cigarette slowly, smoke curling into the heavy air. The silence stretched too long, like a held breath. Then, without warning, the screen flared to life again. Not the corridor this time, a stage, the very stage he was sitting on. Malloy froze as he realized what he was watching himself projected in grainy black and white. The reel was still running, but he hadn't threaded anything into the machine. The palace was playing him now, every gesture, every drag of his cigarette perfectly mirrored on the screen. Then the image shifted. His projection rose from the chair, walked calmly toward the bricked passage, and vanished into the dark. The audience phantom silhouettes that filled the seats applauded in unison. Malloy's cigarette trembled between his fingers. "That's not me," he whispered. "That's your script." The shadows pressed closer, sliding across the velvet aisles. He heard footsteps above in the balcony, in the walls. The palace was alive, every inch of it an actor in the performance. He grabbed the revolver from his coat, aimed it at the projector, and fired. The glass shattered, sparks flying. The screen flickered violently, the image stuttering between his real body and the scripted one. For a moment, both versions of Malloy existed, one sitting firm in his chair, one walking obediently into the passage. He dropped the revolver, clutched the script, and shouted, "No curtain call tonight." Tearing the final page free, he crumpled it in his fist, sweat and ink smearing together. The shadows shrieked. The applause turned into a roar, deafening. The bricked passage collapsed inward on the screen, bricks tumbling in the silence, and then silence. The lights came up harsh and ordinary. The stage was empty. The theater seats were still velvet, unmoving. The script in Malloy's hand had turned blank, every page washed white. For the first time in months, the palace was quiet. Just a dusty theater, no corridor, no director, no audience. Malloy stood shakily, unsure whether he'd won or only bought time. His revolver lay useless on the stage. He picked it up anyway, holstered it, and walked out into the morning light. The city was unchanged. Cars honked, pedestrians rushed past. To them, the palace was just another crumbling building. But Malloy knew better. He knew the cost of silence. Back at the precinct, he wrote his final report. Case unresolved. Klein, Jameson, Morelli, all presumed missing. Possible connection to organized crime, but no evidence. No bodies, no closure. He didn't mention the script, or the shadows, or the fact that when he closed his eyes, he could still hear faint applause. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Malloy actually disrupted the palace's curse or simply delayed it, another man consumed by obsession. Some claim the disappearances stopped after his intervention. Others whisper the cycle continues only slower, waiting for the next performance. Malloy never returned to the palace, but on certain nights when the city quieted and the streets glowed with rain, he swore he saw its marquee light up again, letters rattling in the wind, now playing the last performance, and he would turn away, clutching his coat tighter, refusing to look back, because he knew once the curtain rises, the story never ends.
So, what do you think really happened inside the Palace Theater? Was it a mob cover up dressed in superstition or something far stranger that couldn't be written off as coincidence? The truth lingers in the shadows, and maybe that's where it belongs. The Locked Theater remains one of those mysteries that balances on the edge of reality and imagination, a place where history, crime, and folklore blur into one seamless performance. Even after Malloy walked away, the questions never stopped. What happened to Robert Klein? Did Vincent Morelli really vanish in front of him, or was it another sleight of hand? And most of all, did the palace stop hungering, or is it still waiting for the next detective bold enough to enter its stage? When we tell stories like this, we're reminded how thin the curtain can be between truth and legend.
Investigators are still debating whether the vanishings were orchestrated by men in smoke filled rooms or if they were swallowed by a theater that had learned to write its own endings. Maybe both can be true, maybe neither. What we know is simple: the palace still stands, though boarded and silent. Some nights locals swear they hear applause drifting from its broken windows. Others claim to see flickering lights, as though a show is still running behind the curtain. And that's what makes this story endure. Not the facts, not the files, not even the names of the missing, but the feeling it leaves behind. That uneasy thought that somewhere out there a stage is waiting its script unwritten, and maybe just maybe you're already in it.